Within a matter of hours, U.S. intelligence agencies had fingered Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda network as responsible for attacking New York and Washington. Nonetheless, the president chose to look beyond specific threats. The problem was bigger than bin Laden, bigger than al-Qaeda. In framing that problem, he employed broad, even feverish, ideological language. Here's the president speaking to the American people, and by extension to the entire world, on September 20th, 2001.
Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate what they see right here in this chamber, a democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other. They want to overthrow existing governments in many Muslim countries, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. They want to drive Israel out of the Middle East. They want to drive Christians and Jews out of vast regions of Asia and Africa. These terrorists kill not merely to end lives, but to disrupt and end a way of life. With every atrocity, they hope that America grows fearful, retreating from the world and forsaking our friends. They stand against us because we stand in their way. We're not deceived by their pretenses to piety. We have seen their kind before. They are the heirs of all the murderous ideologies of the 20th century. By sacrificing human life to serve their radical visions, by abandoning every value except the will to power, they follow in the path of fascism, Nazism, and totalitarianism. And they will follow that path all the way to where it ends, in history's unmarked grave of discarded lies.
The United States was at war, all right, and it was a war of cosmic significance. Here at the beginning of the 21st century was a conflict akin to the conflicts that had defined the 20th century. Or as Bush and many other Americans would have it, conflicts that had enabled the United States itself to define the 20th century. Achieving conclusive victory in a global war on terrorism would enable the United States to define the 21st century as well. President Bush was determined to make the 21st century another American century. Bush's Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, stated the matter even more crisply. Speaking at a Pentagon press conference on September 18, 2001, he defined the problem facing the United States this way. We have a choice, either to change the way we live, which is unacceptable, or to change the way that they live. And we chose the latter. The American way of life itself was under attack. That way of life was not up for negotiation. Americans were not going to change, no way, no how. Therefore, the United States was going to oblige the other side to change the way that they live. The other side being the billion-plus inhabitants of the Islamic world. This looked like a tall order, to put it mildly. What if that billion didn't want to change? Who was going to make them? What was going to force them to submit? To that question, the Bush administration had a clear answer. American power, above all military power, adroitly applied. So the immediate imperatives facing the Bush administration in the fall of 2001, as it launched what was now called the global war on terrorism, were twofold. The first was to hone that power. The second was to unleash it. Honing was Secretary Rumsfeld's job, perhaps his obsession. Even before 9/11, he had embarked upon a bold program of military reform. The anodyne Pentagon term for the project was transformation. By capitalizing on advanced technology, transformation was going to enhance U.S. capabilities. U.S. forces would become smarter, faster, more agile, and more effective. The improvements would be dazzling, radical, utterly without precedent. Now, there was no doubt that U.S. forces were already far and away the world's best. For Rumsfeld, however, that wasn't anywhere near good enough. He wanted them to be the best in tomorrow's world. Transformation was about achieving permanent, unquestioned military supremacy. The term that the Pentagon devised for this was full-spectrum dominance. Here's full-spectrum dominance depicted in a typical military PowerPoint briefing as the product of preeminence in the realm of information. Here's the way it looked to a snarky cartoonist. Our slick drone making short work of everyone else's old-fashioned kite, while those holding the string are taken out as collateral damage. Such was the idea, anyway. The second imperative, unleashing American power, meant changing the rules that defined how the United States operated in the world. The so-called Patriot Act, signed into law in October 2001, was one such rule changer. The Congress thrusting into the hands of the executive branch vast new prerogatives relating to things like surveillance, detention, and interrogation. In a future lesson, we'll examine the implications of this legislation, which ought to have been called the Snoop, Snatch, and Torture Act. But there was a second rule-changing effort undertaken by the President himself without congressional authorization or concurrence. This one related to the use of armed force. Now, traditionally, the United States had always claimed to consider the use of force as a last resort, even if U.S. presidents had not adhered to this norm in practice. They had at least paid it lip service. Aggression was a sin for others, Germans, Japanese, Russians, Communist Koreans, Communist Vietnamese, and the like. When the United States acted, it did so in response to aggression, to preserve the existing order, not to overturn it. In the wake of 9/11, the United States abandoned this position. The Bush administration decided that it could no longer let the other guy make the first move. It embraced what some called a stance of anticipatory self-defense. The operative idea was to employ force to prevent your opponent from ever posing a threat. Kick him in the nuts before he even has a chance to make a fist. For the United States, the existing order in the greater Middle East had now become intolerable. The object of the exercise was now to overturn it and replace it with something better. That is, with something more to Washington's liking. Speaking to graduating cadets at West Point in June 2002, President Bush made the case this way. For much of the last century, America's defense relied on the Cold War doctrines of deterrence and containment. But new threats also require new thinking. If we wait for threats to fully materialize, we will have waited too long. We must take the battle to the enemy, disrupt his plans, and confront the worst threats before they emerge. In the world we have entered, the only path to safety is the path of action. And this nation will act. This path of action became known as the Bush Doctrine. In effect, the Bush Doctrine claimed for the United States, and for the United States alone, the prerogative of waging preventive war, hitherto universally condemned as illegal and immoral. As far as Washington was concerned, preventive war was still illegal and immoral, except in those instances when the President of the United States decided otherwise. Then, it was not only permissible, but also necessary. Full-spectrum dominance harnessed to the Bush Doctrine. This was the formula that promised to enable the United States to change the way they live, spreading freedom, and thereby freeing Americans from any obligation to critically examine the arrangements upholding their own way of life. In practice, however, complications lurked just around the corner. Those complications began in Afghanistan, of all places.